was the doctor's opinion, and there were 4 main points that I extrapolated from last week's video. And if you haven't seen that yet, it's over on YouTube or on Patreon, wherever you can find it. It's also on the website. And the 4 points are that any description of alcoholism omitting the physical factor is incomplete. In other words, any description of the alcoholic that leaves out what happens to an alcoholic after taking the first drink, that's an incomplete picture. Also, the word allergy, which Dr. Silkworth uses in the book, from a layman's point of view, which we are, the big book authors are laymen, we're laymen reading it, seems to be an accurate analogy at the very least to describe what this physical factor entails. The fact that once we take alcohol into our system, it triggers some sort of reaction that's abnormal and averse and not in keeping with the majority of people who drink. The spiritual solution is altruistic and spiritual. The spiritual solution is spiritual. That's a little redundant. But the solution is spiritual and altruistic. They tell us that. And they do also allude to medical detox maybe being appropriate or even necessary in some cases before a person can fully accept a spiritual solution to their problem. Okay, so we're going to be in the doctor's opinion at the start of the second letter. I'm really awkward with these Roman numeral page numbers, especially since I'm using this study edition and it doesn't have all the forewords in the beginning, the first edition, second edition, all that. So the Roman numerals for this book are a little off from, if you're using the typical blue book or even the little mini red book, the page numbers might be a little different. So I'm not going to attempt to give you the Roman numeral page numbers. I'll just say go to the doctor's opinion, start at the very beginning, and from the very start, you're going to look for the second place that the second letter starts, and it's going to be the doctor writes. I want to say that's 2 pages in or 1 page in. If you turn the page once from the very beginning of the doctor's opinion, you should see the start of the second letter, and that's where we left off last week. So the doctor writes, the subject presented in this book seems to me to be of paramount importance to those afflicted with alcoholic addiction. Couple of interesting things to note. First of all, alcoholic addiction is quite a term, and there's a lot of hubbub in certain rooms regarding how a person introduces themselves and alcoholic addict. But this is an interesting term here, alcoholic addiction. I just think it's worth noting. But the more important thing I'd like to discuss is that the subject matter presented in this book seems to be of paramount importance to those afflicted with alcoholic addiction. Like, the subject matter isn't alcoholic addiction. The subject matter is how to connect with God. And they tell us that in several places, the most notable of which that I'm going to reference is page 45, where it says, where and how are we to find this power, meaning power greater than ourselves. And then the next sentence is, well, that's exactly what this book is about. It's about where and how to find power. And so that's the subject that ought to be of paramount importance to those afflicted with alcoholic addiction, not alcoholism. I mean, obviously we need to know what the problem is before we can attempt to solve it, but the real meat and potatoes, if you will, the real message of depth and weight is going to be the spiritual and altruistic solution. The doctor continues with, I say this after many years' experience as medical director of one of the oldest hospitals in the country treating alcoholic and drug addiction. Again, just pointing out doctor's opinion, right? He worked with both. However, that's quite an endorsement that he is saying that this book is of extreme importance, paramount meaning above everything else. This is the most important piece of literature someone suffering from alcoholic and drug addiction can read, according to the leading expert at one of the oldest hospitals treating alcoholic and drug addiction. That's quite an endorsement. Like, none of the books he studied to become a doctor, none of the books he's read since becoming a doctor, none of the books he's offered any of his patients up to this point are more useful than this book, according to him, in this letter. Now, that's pretty powerful. He goes on to say, there was, therefore, a real sense of satisfaction when I was asked to contribute a few words on a subject which is covered in such masterly detail in these pages. So he's not begrudgingly writing this letter. He wasn't paid to write these letters. He is writing this letter happily. He's excited to be invited into this. This is something that warms his heart as a medical professional to be able to contribute to what he considers to be such an important book. He goes on to say, we doctors have realized for a long time that some form of moral psychology was of urgent importance to alcoholics, but its application presented difficulties beyond our conception. Now that's a pretty deep sentence, right? He is saying for quite some time, the members of the medical fraternity have known that the solution for alcoholism seems to be beyond the scope of medicine. Moral psychology, that's an interesting term, and I looked it up a while ago to try to figure out what the heck it means, and the definition is just as vague as the term itself. But it is referring to basically a form of psychology that has to do with altruism and spirituality. Not the inner workings of the mind and not the inner workings of the body, but the inner workings of the spirit, right? And so how do medical professionals talk about such things? Well, they have to apply a somewhat scientific term to it, which they call moral psychology. Later on, the doctor is going to refer again to this thing as the psychic change. These are terms that medical doctors are a little more comfortable using. They're a little more professional sounding because we can't just say spiritual awakening as a doctor, right? But again, they've known that for quite some time. There's an interesting section of the book where Carl Jung, the father of modern psychology, is talking to one of the contributors of this book and tells him basically, you're hopeless. And you know, we'll get to that page obviously in the big book study, but it's somewhat important right now. And you know, watch me not be able to find it. That would be hilarious. Okay, so it basically page 26 and 27, they tell the story of the man who goes to visit. And I'm not a historical buff with some of this stuff. If you're watching this and you know who this individual is going to meet with Carl Jung, leave it in the comments. I'd be happy to be edified on that. But he goes and talks to Carl Jung, and Jung basically tells him, you're hopeless. And the man says, well, why are you saying I'm hopeless? Is there no exception? I mean, if you went to a doctor for a condition that you had, and the doctor said, sorry, bud, you're hopeless, your first question would be, are you sure? Like, there's not even one case of somebody recovering from this? Like, nobody gets better from this? You're saying I'm just stuck? That would be the question, I would imagine. And Jung's response to that is, yes, there is. Exceptions to cases such as yours have been occurring since early times. Here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are a phenomenon. They appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men are suddenly cast to one side, and completely new conceptions a new set of conceptions and motives begins to dominate them. I probably should have created a slide. I didn't realize I'd be reading all of this ahead of time. But anyway, we'll skip to the part where he says, in fact, I've been trying to produce some such emotional rearrangement within you. With many individuals, the methods which I have employed are successful, but I've never been successful with an alcoholic of your description. Right? And so these types of alcoholics, these hopeless alcoholics, and we're going to discover why Silkworth considers them hopeless next week. What the doctor is saying is confirmed by Carl Jung's words on page 27, which is, we've known for a while that this is going to take some sort of spiritual connectedness, but we have Carl Jung as a psychologist saying, I've been unable to produce that in you. And we have Dr. Silkworth as a medical doctor saying, I'm unable to produce that in you. We know it's the solution. It's beyond the scope of our individual practices. You know, which always amazes me, you know, when I encounter someone and I offer them a spiritual solution and they're convinced, well, I just need to get my medication straight. Or I need to, you know, go, you know, get my psychological issues and my trauma straightened out and then I'll be fine. Or I need to go, it's like, okay, keep relying on medical doctors and psychologists, the experts in both those fields who have said, this stuff we can't help with. Right? And so it's just interesting, the historical reference of some of this literature that we've lost touch with. Anyway, I've gone off the deep end on that. So he goes on to say, its application presented difficulties beyond our conception. What with our ultra-modern standards, our scientific approach to everything, we are perhaps not well equipped to apply the powers of good that lie outside our synthetic knowledge. And that's just a fancy way of saying, like, all the facts and figures and data crunching and tables and research that we have at our disposal doesn't scratch the surface of the spiritual realm. We, the powers of good, so to speak. Like, how do we go approach that? It's outside the realm of all this concrete, tangible stuff that we're working with. Now, that's not just, here the doctor's simply writing that about himself and his fellow colleagues in the medical fraternity, but what's interesting is that oftentimes newcomers are very much stuck on this as well, because they can't see it, feel it, taste it, touch it, smell it, hear it. It lies outside the powers of their own synthetic, observable, tangible knowledge. They disregard it entirely and refute it entirely as being outright. Later, that part in the book says at first what seems a flimsy reed eventually turns out to be the loving hand of God. It's like, yeah, this stuff feels like it's not going to help because I can't grasp it with my tangible synthetic knowledge. So this applies, here specifically to doctors, but it can also apply to, the new people struggling. Okay, next paragraph. Many years ago, one of the leading contributors to this book came under our care in this hospital, and while here, he acquired some ideas which he put into practical application at once. A couple of things. The application of the 12 steps, and that's what they're talking about. By the way, the leading contributor they're talking about, the leading contributors to this book, one of them, the guy he's talking about here is Bill Wilson. Now, he did not write the book like a lot of people think. He was one of the leading contributors. He wrote the majority of it. What he wrote was heavily edited. There's a whole chapter he didn't write. He didn't write the doctor's opinion, obviously, or most of it. And so, to say that Bill Wilson wrote the book is a little bit incorrect. He didn't write the book Alcoholics Anonymous. He was one of the leading contributors to it, the main driving force behind it, but it had several co-authors. That's why he's not credited with authorship. If you look on the title page, he's not credited with authorship for the book. So one of the leading contributors of the book came under our care in this hospital, and Silkworth tells this story in the first letter about Bill Wilson coming to Towns Hospital. And while here, he acquired some ideas which he put into practical application at once. So the application of this stuff is practical. Even though it's spiritual and lies outside the bounds of our synthetic knowledge, applying these things has practical, tangible results. And he puts it into application at once. There's an important set of words, at once. And we'll see this throughout the directions for working the steps throughout the rest of the 164. At once, immediately, next we launched. Like, it's always action, action, more action, at once. Okay, we have time for one more paragraph, I think. The next paragraph. Later, he requested the privilege of being allowed to tell his story to other patients here, in Towns Hospital, and with some misgiving, we consented. The cases we have followed through have been most interesting. In fact, many of them are amazing. In other words, Bill Wilson is a fluke. He didn't just have some kind of weird, acid trip in the hospital, and the doctor just said, I've heard that story before, that Bill's detoxing when he sees this flash of light or whatever. He shares it with Silkworth. Silkworth's pretty convinced that it's something to do with the medication and the detox, but he says, hey, run with it. Whatever's going to help you, run with it. Well, that's true that that's what Silkworth was thinking, but it's not true that that's what Bill Wilson was going through, because if it had been merely just some sort of psychosis-induced hallucination on Bill's part, he would not have been able to induce that in other people at this hospital. But here we're seeing the doctor saying, look, we followed through with a lot of the cases of people that Bill has come to work with, and many of them are amazing. Many of these cases are amazing. So there's a track record of duplicatability, if that's a word, duplicatability. It's duplicatable. Bill is duplicating in other people the experience that he himself has had. The unselfishness of these men, as we have come to know them, the entire absence of profit motive, and their community spirit is indeed inspiring to one who has labored long and wearily in this alcoholic field. Now, whether or not you work professionally in the alcoholic field or simply have hung around the rooms for a considerable amount of time, when you've labored long and wearily in the company of alcoholics and addicts who are attempting to and failing at, and re-attempting to and failing at, and re-attempting to, the retreads and the in and out and the revolving door, and see this year after year, people dying and people struggling, witnessing someone finally get it, and being absent of profit motive and community spirit and unselfishness, and to see that personality change in people where they're just selflessly giving of themselves, like, that's amazing. That is indeed inspiring, whether you work professionally or just hang around the rooms. Like, to finally see that click in someone is absolutely inspiring. Later on page 89, they say, this is an experience you must not miss. We know you will not want to miss it. That's powerful to me. They believe in themselves, the doctor writes, they believe in themselves, and still more in the power which pulls chronic alcoholics back from the gates of death. Back from the gates of death, that's an interesting, that's sort of a throwback to page 30, where the big book authors write, many pursue it in the gates of insanity and death. And so the doctor's saying, this power pulls people back from that. But notice that power is capitalized here, capital P, power. And one of the rules that we're going to adhere to during this big book study is that anytime we see a word, I think I just had a glitch in my camera, sorry. Anytime we see a word that's capitalized in the book that normally wouldn't be, we know that that word is referring to God. And I wrote an interesting, well, I think it's interesting. I did some research and wrote an article, and maybe I'll post it in the description below, a link to it. I wrote an article about, every instance of the word God, or a version of the word God that's used in the book. How many times does the big book mention the word God? And I've got that article, and I'll post a link in the description to that. I also wrote another one called the 7 Names for God That You Wish You Had Understood Sooner, and maybe I'll post a link to that as well. Anyway, that's all the time we have today. We will stop there. I just want to give a quick reminder that I'm giving away one copy of this study edition big book, not mine, obviously, because I filled this thing with notes, and I own it. It's mine. I've had it for years. But I'll send you a brand new copy of the study edition big book. It's got dictionary definitions in the back from the 1937 dictionary, so the definitions that were in use at the time it was written. A word and subject index in the back, so you can look up things like how many times does the book use the word recovered, or disease, or must. It's got blank pages. Every other page in this book is blank. Maybe you can see that, with lines on it, so that you're not high resolution there. Oh, I'm looking in the back. Blank pages, right? Every other page is blank, so you can take some notes. And it's got historical footnotes. It's got these nifty little, ribbons to keep places in a big book study. And I'll give you a choice of burgundy or black. It's a nice hardcover. It's completely free to join that contest. You join through bigbookwizard.net. I'll put a link in the bottom below. And I'll tell you, last time I checked, there's exactly one person enrolled in this contest. So if you enrolled, you know who you are. So, go ahead and sign up for that. Your name will stay in until you win. And I'll be sending one of those out every month. And actually next week, I'll be announcing the winner to that contest of who's getting that study edition big book. Also, if you'd like one of these fancy bookmarks I created, you can't see it very well here, but there's the front, there's the back. It's a nice, glossy, sturdy bookmark. Consider supporting me on Patreon. It's only $5 a month, and I'll send you one of those bookmarks as a way of saying thank you. And if you want to connect with me on social media, there's a lot of my info there that you can, I won't read it all, but you can take it down to find me on social media or find me on the internet. And with that, I bid you adieu until next time, and I'll say God bless. Thanks for attending.